The Handley Page Halifax emerged from the urgent demands of the late 1930s, when the shadow of war loomed large over Europe, and Britain's Royal Air Force sought a new generation of heavy bombers to replace aging designs. The interwar years had seen the RAF gradually transition from biplanes to more advanced monoplanes, yet by the time Germany annexed Czechoslovakia in 1938, it was clear that the service lacked the long-range striking power necessary for sustained conflict. The Air Ministry issued specifications for a heavy bomber capable of carrying significant bomb loads deep into enemy territory, with the endurance to operate at night and in difficult conditions. Handley Page, already a prominent name in British aviation, responded with a design that would eventually become the Halifax. The initial proposal was not for a four-engine bomber, but for a twin-engine design powered by the Rolls-Royce Vulture, an ambitious engine under development at the time. Known as the HP-56, this early concept promised a streamlined airframe capable of high speed and heavy payloads. However, concerns quickly grew regarding the Vulture's reliability and the inherent limitations of twin-engine performance in a heavy bomber role. As events in Europe escalated, the Air Ministry encouraged Handley Page to adapt the design to a four-engine configuration, taking advantage of the proven Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. This adaptation fundamentally reshaped the aircraft, giving birth to the HP-57, which would later be named the Halifax. The design challenges were significant. Engineers had to balance lift, stability, and bomb load while ensuring the airframe could withstand long missions and defensive fire. The Halifax was conceived with a mid-mounted wing, retractable undercarriage, and a long, narrow fuselage housing multiple defensive gun positions. The use of four Merlins gave it the necessary power, though engineers struggled to optimize aerodynamics and manage weight. The cockpit offered a relatively good field of vision, while the bomb bay was large enough to accommodate a wide range of ordnance. Handley Page also aimed to make the Halifax adaptable, with potential for reconnaissance and transport roles. By 1939, with war now inevitable, the Halifax project gained urgency. The first prototype flew in September 1939, only weeks after Britain entered the war. The aircraft demonstrated promise, but also revealed shortcomings in handling and performance at altitude. Engineers worked feverishly to refine the design, making adjustments to wing structure, engine cooling, and defensive armament. Despite these teething troubles, the RAF pressed ahead. The strategic need for a modern heavy bomber outweighed the risks, and the Halifax was ordered into production before all design issues had been resolved. The Halifax thus emerged as part of the heavy bomber triad, alongside the Avro Lancaster and Short Stirling. Though it would never match the Lancaster in fame or performance, the Halifax was indispensable in expanding Bomber Command's striking power. Its origins reflected the realities of wartime urgency, a design adapted and rushed into service under the pressure of necessity, destined to play a major role despite inherent compromises. The prototype phase of the Handley Page Halifax unfolded under the pressure of both urgency and improvisation. With the outbreak of war in September 1939, the RAF and Handley Page could not afford the luxury of prolonged testing or incremental development. The first prototype, designated L7244, took to the air on 25 October 1939, piloted by Handley Page's chief test pilot, Major James Cordes. From the outset, the aircraft revealed itself as a promising but far from flawless machine. Its four Merlin X engines provided adequate power, and the large mid-wing design gave it a distinctive presence in the sky. Yet the prototype also displayed issues with handling, particularly at high altitude, where performance fell short of expectations. Engineers quickly set about refining the design. Early testing revealed that engine cooling was problematic, and modifications were made to the nacelles and airflow systems. The Halifax's stability at altitude was also less than ideal, limiting its ability to operate effectively above 20,000 feet. This was a critical drawback, since operating at higher altitudes could provide better protection from flak and enemy fighters. Nevertheless, the Air Ministry and the RAF judged the aircraft acceptable for production, driven by the urgent need for new bombers to replace outdated types like the Whitley and Hampton. The initial production version, the Halifax MKY, incorporated a number of changes from the prototype. Armament was increased, with a nose turret, dorsal turret, and tail turret, giving it 4 to 6 .303 Browning machine guns depending on configuration. Defensive coverage was considered adequate by the standards of 1940, though limited compared to what would be demanded as the air war intensified. The bomb bay could carry up to 13,000 pounds of ordnance, although in practice the average loads were often lower to preserve range and performance. Flight trials of the first production aircraft confirmed the Halifax as a workable design, though not without flaws. Pilots praised its relative ease of handling compared to the short Sterling, whose heavy controls and poor high-altitude capability limited its usefulness. However, the Halifax's ceiling and climb rate remained unsatisfactory, and the aircraft was noticeably slower than its projected speeds. Even so, the balance of bomb load, defensive armament, and adaptability convinced Bomber Command that the Halifax was viable for large-scale use. Production ramped up quickly across multiple factories, with subcontractors brought in to meet demand. Handley Page's own facility at Radlett was joined by English Electric and London Aircraft Production Group, which assembled Halifaxes in dispersed factories to reduce vulnerability to German bombing. The reliance on distributed manufacturing also reflected the scale of the program. Thousands of Halifaxes would be required to meet Bomber Command's plans for night offensive operations. By late 1940, the first squadrons began receiving the Halifax MKY training units, prepared crews for the transition, emphasizing the coordination required to manage the 4 engines, complex defensive systems, and large bomb load. Maintenance crews also faced a steep learning curve, adapting to the new airframe and the constant need to address engine reliability and airframe fatigue under heavy operational use. Early test flights and acceptance trials made clear that the Halifax was not a perfect machine, but in the desperate circumstances of the early war, it was considered good enough. What it lacked in high-altitude performance, it compensated with load-carrying flexibility and relative ease of production. These qualities ensured that despite its flaws, the Halifax would soon take its place in the front line of Bomber Command's growing campaign against Germany. The Halifax entered operational service with No. 35 Squadron at Linton-on-Ouse in March 1941, marking the beginning of its active role in Bomber Command's campaign against Germany. Its first mission, carried out on the night of 10 or 11 March, targeted the docks at Le Havre. Though limited in scale, this sortie demonstrated the Halifax's ability to carry a heavier bomb load than earlier British bombers while integrating into night operations that would increasingly define the RAF's strategic offensive. The crews reported that the aircraft was stable and manageable on long flights, but they also noted its sluggish performance at altitude and the constant need for vigilance against enemy fighters. The early operational role of the Halifax highlighted both its strengths and its vulnerabilities. On the positive side, the bomber could carry significant loads over long distances, allowing it to reach heavily defended industrial targets in the Ruhr Valley and beyond. Its bomb bay could accommodate not only conventional bombs, but also mines for maritime operations, giving it a degree of versatility that Bomber Command valued. Its defensive armament, though modest by later standards, provided crews with some confidence when facing night fighters. Compared to the short Sterling, the Halifax was better balanced and less hampered by altitude restrictions, making it a more practical frontline bomber. Yet problems emerged almost immediately. Crews discovered that the Halifax was unable to operate effectively above 20,000 feet, a serious limitation at a time when German air defenses were improving rapidly. Its speed was also insufficient to outpace night fighters, leaving it exposed during missions deep into the Reich. Pilots frequently reported difficulty maintaining formation at higher altitudes, and the engines, though reliable, were often strained to the limit on long flights. Loss rates, while initially acceptable, began to rise as Luftwaffe defenses adapted to RAF night operations. Bomber Command's leadership nonetheless pressed the Halifax into wider service, integrating it into multiple squadrons throughout 1941 and 1942. It became a central part of the early phase of the strategic bombing offensive, flying missions against Cologne, Essen, and Hamburg. Air crews valued its handling qualities on takeoff and landing, especially when loaded heavily, but they remained acutely aware that the Halifax was not the equal of the Avro Lancaster, which began entering service in late 1941. Many crewmen who transitioned between the two types later recalled that the Lancaster offered superior performance in both altitude and payload, a comparison that haunted the Halifax throughout its career. Despite these criticisms, the Halifax earned its place through sheer numbers and availability. Squadrons equipped with the type carried out some of the most significant raids of the early bombing campaign, including the first 1,000-bomber raid on Cologne in May 1942. The Halifax contributed heavily to this operation, demonstrating the RAF's growing capacity for mass strategic bombing. However, combat reports revealed again that Halifaxes suffered higher losses than Lancasters, largely because of their lower operational ceiling and less favorable defensive layout. Bomber Command commanders debated the continued use of the Halifax, with some pressing for its replacement by the Lancaster as quickly as production allowed. Yet the Halifax could not be dispensed with. It represented a substantial share of Britain's heavy bomber strength, and wartime necessity dictated that it remain in frontline service. Efforts began to refine and adapt the design, seeking to improve survivability and performance. By the end of 1942, the Halifax was firmly established in operational use. It was flying deep penetration raids, mine-laying sorties, and experimental missions involving new bomb loads. Aircrew opinions remained mixed, respect for its sturdiness and ease of handling tempered by frustration at its vulnerability and limitations. For Bomber Command, the Halifax was both indispensable and imperfect, a bomber that filled a crucial role in the early stages of the air offensive while never quite escaping the shadow of its more famous stablemate, the Lancaster. The expansion of Halifax operations during 1942 confirmed its role as a workhorse of Bomber Command, even if it was already clear that the aircraft had shortcomings that would never be fully overcome. No, 35 Squadron's early missions were soon followed by the re-equipment of several more units, and by the middle of the year, Halifaxes were flying nightly against German industrial centers. These missions revealed both the durability of the type and the serious risks crews faced each time they left British airfields. In combat, the Halifax showed itself capable of carrying a wide range of ordnance, from conventional high-explosive bombs to naval mines for operations in the North Sea and Bay of Biscay. Its large bomb bay allowed considerable flexibility in planning raids, and commanders valued its ability to deliver both concentrated and mixed loads. The bomber was also used in early trials of larger special weapons, including the 4,000-pound Cookie Blast bomb, although its bomb bay dimensions limited its suitability for some of the heaviest loads later deployed by Lancasters. Aircrews appreciated certain features of the Halifax, particularly its forgiving landing characteristics and relatively stable handling during long missions. Unlike the Sterling, which suffered from altitude restrictions due to its wing design, the Halifax could at least attempt to operate at medium altitudes suitable for Bomber Command's tactics. Yet operational experience quickly highlighted its vulnerabilities. At altitudes above 20,000 feet, the Halifax became difficult to control, and its performance dropped sharply. German night fighters equipped with upward-firing cannon, Schräge Musik, exploited these weaknesses, preying on Halifaxes that could not climb as high or maneuver as effectively as Lancasters. The first 1,000-bomber raid against Cologne in May 1942 underlined these realities. Halifax squadrons contributed significantly to the massed force, proving that the RAF could deliver devastating blows against German cities. But casualty reports revealed that Halifax units suffered proportionally heavier losses than those equipped with Lancasters. Crews returned with tales of fierce opposition and of comrades lost to night fighters and flak, reinforcing the perception that the Halifax was less survivable in contested skies. Still, necessity dictated its continued use. The Lancaster was only beginning to arrive in strength, and Britain's bombing offensive depended on every available heavy bomber. Halifaxes flew in virtually every major operation of 1942, including raids on Essen, Hamburg, and Dusseldorf. They were also tasked with mine-laying sorties in the approaches to German ports, missions often carried out at low altitude and great risk. Loss rates remained troubling, but the Halifax's sheer availability ensured that it carried a significant portion of Bomber Command's burden during this period. Among RAF leadership, the Halifax performance prompted debate. Sir Arthur Harris, Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command, preferred the Lancaster and often criticized the Halifax as inadequate for the demands of the strategic offensive. Other officers argued that continued refinement might yet close the performance gap. The crews themselves were divided. Many respected the Halifax for its ruggedness and reliability under stress, while others lamented its inability to climb higher or escape enemy fighters. By late 1942, the Halifax was firmly embedded in Bomber Command's order of battle. It was not the perfect bomber, nor the favored one, but it was essential. Each sortie added to the cumulative weight of Britain's air offensive, and each loss highlighted the cost of operating a machine that could not entirely hide from enemy defenses. The Halifax had proven itself operationally useful, but its limitations were now undeniable, shaping both its reputation and the course of its future development. From 1943 onward, the Halifax became one of the central instruments of the RAF's night bombing campaign, flying deep into Germany during the intensification of the strategic offensive. By this stage, Bomber Command had committed to mass raids against major cities and industrial centers, and the Halifax was tasked with shouldering a significant share of the burden. Its role was both indispensable and dangerous, as the aircraft's vulnerabilities became starkly evident in the face of increasingly sophisticated German defenses. Operational records show that Halifax squadrons flew missions against virtually every major target in the Reich: Hamburg, Berlin, the Ruhr, industrial heartland, and later, long-range raids to Leipzig and beyond. These missions demonstrated the bomber's capacity to deliver heavy loads consistently, but they also underscored its shortcomings. Crews frequently noted that the Halifax struggled to reach the altitudes where enemy flak was less accurate, and its slower speed made it more vulnerable to interception. In the Great Firestorm raid on Hamburg in July 1943, Halifax units took part in the devastating attack, yet casualty figures showed again that their loss rate exceeded that of Lancaster squadrons operating alongside them. The Luftwaffe's night fighter force, equipped with radar and upward-firing cannon, inflicted a heavy toll on Halifax formations. Pilots of the German Nachtjagd repeatedly exploited the bomber's lower operational ceiling, positioning themselves underneath the aircraft where its defensive guns could not respond. Halifax losses reached critical levels during the Battle of Berlin in the winter of 1943-44, a series of raids in which Bomber Command sought to break German resistance through sustained attacks on the capital. In these operations, Halifaxes often lost up to 10% of their force in a single night, a rate that commanders considered unsustainable. Adaptation was therefore essential. Handley Page and the RAF introduced modifications aimed at improving survivability. New marks of the Halifax incorporated more powerful Bristol Hercules radial engines, which, though less refined than the Merlins, provided greater reliability and improved high-altitude performance. Defensive armament was also upgraded with stronger tail turrets and better dorsal coverage. Structural changes to the wings and fuselage aimed to improve stability at altitude, addressing one of the aircraft's most persistent weaknesses. These improvements reduced loss rates somewhat, but the Halifax never fully overcame its inherent disadvantages compared to the Lancaster. Despite this, the bomber proved versatile in adapting to a variety of operational roles beyond the main bombing offensive. It became a key platform for special operations executive missions, dropping agents and supplies behind enemy lines in occupied Europe. Its range and load capacity made it suitable for long, low-level flights over hostile territory, where crews often faced extreme danger but were essential in supporting resistance movements. Halifax squadrons also played a role in maritime patrol and mine-laying operations, disrupting German naval routes and U-boat movements. As Allied strategy shifted toward preparation for the invasion of France in 1944, Halifax units took part in attacks on transport hubs, coastal defenses, and troop concentrations. In the months leading to D-Day, they bombed railway yards, bridges, and fortifications, supporting the broader campaign to weaken German capabilities in Western Europe. During Operation Overlord itself, Halifax squadrons contributed to both direct bombardment and the deployment of paratroopers and glider troops. Their broad utility kept them in demand even as the Lancaster carried out the most high-profile raids. By late 1944 and into 1945, the Halifax was flying in a transformed operational environment. German defenses had been weakened by continuous bombing, fuel shortages, and Allied air superiority by day. The bomber's losses decreased, and it continued to contribute to the destruction of German infrastructure and morale in the final months of the war. Though overshadowed in reputation by the Lancaster, the Halifax had carried out more than 75,000 sorties by the end of the conflict, dropping over 220,000 tons of bombs. The combat record of the Halifax is thus one of both endurance and sacrifice. It never achieved the acclaim of its stablemate, but it bore an enormous share of the offensive at a time when Britain needed every available bomber. Its crews paid a heavy price, with more than 6,000 Halifaxes lost in combat and tens of thousands of airmen killed or captured. The aircraft could not hide from its limitations, yet it adapted to fulfill roles far beyond those for which it was originally conceived, leaving a record of service that was as complex as it was essential. The development of the Halifax did not stand still during the war. Continuous modifications were introduced in an effort to address its shortcomings, enhance its performance, and adapt it to a wide range of operational requirements. From its earliest production versions through to its final wartime marks, the Halifax evolved significantly, reflecting both technological innovation and the shifting demands of the air war. The initial Halifax Mk1, powered by Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, entered service with limited defensive armament and inadequate altitude performance. It was soon superseded by the Mk2, which introduced changes to the tail unit and stronger defensive gun turrets. The Mk2 also incorporated structural improvements designed to stabilize the aircraft at higher altitudes, though the gains remained modest. The Mk3 represented a more decisive step, replacing the Merlins with Bristol Hercules radial engines. This not only reduced reliance on Rolls-Royce's strained Merlin production lines, but also gave the Halifax improved reliability and better performance under heavy loads. The Hercules proved more rugged in combat, less prone to catastrophic failure, and capable of sustaining long missions despite battle damage. Further refinements followed. The Halifax Mk3 introduced strengthened undercarriages and new defensive arrangements, though it was often relegated to secondary duties such as training and transport. The Mk6 and Mk7, appearing later in the war, were powered by improved Hercules engines and incorporated aerodynamic modifications, including refined propellers and revised wing sections to boost altitude capability and fuel efficiency. These variants were generally considered the best of the series, finally addressing many of the performance concerns that had dogged earlier models. Beyond the core bomber versions, the Halifax proved remarkably adaptable. Special operations variants were stripped of some armament to make space for agents, supply containers, or paratroopers. These aircraft operated on clandestine missions for the Special Operations Executive, inserting resistance fighters into occupied Europe under the cover of night. Others were modified for towing gliders, a role in which the Halifax played a vital part during major airborne operations such as D-Day, Operation Market Garden, and the Rhine crossings in 1945. In these missions, the aircraft hauled large troop-carrying gliders across the Channel, often while under enemy fire, providing essential support to Allied airborne forces. The Halifax also served in maritime and anti-submarine roles. Fitted with radar and depth charges, some variants patrolled the Atlantic, hunting German U-boats that threatened the critical supply lines between North America and Britain. While not as numerous as the dedicated Coastal Command Liberators or Sunderlands, Halifax patrol aircraft contributed meaningfully to the Battle of the Atlantic. In addition, mine-laying missions became a routine assignment for Halifax squadrons, sowing German coastal waters with naval mines to disrupt shipping routes. Production of the Halifax was spread across multiple facilities, with English Electric, Ferry Aviation, Roots, and the London Aircraft Production Group all contributing to the output. This distributed system not only ensured large-scale production, but also highlighted the bomber's status as one of Britain's most important war machines. By the end of the war, more than 6,000 Halifaxes had been built in multiple marks, reflecting the scale of its contribution despite its limitations compared to the Lancaster. Technological evolution within the Halifax series mirrored the larger trajectory of wartime aircraft development, from early compromises and flaws to increasingly specialized and effective tools of war. Although the Lancaster captured more of the spotlight with its ability to carry outsized bombs and operate at higher altitudes, the Halifax's numerous variants ensured it remained a versatile and indispensable platform across a wide spectrum of missions. Its adaptability extended its service life and cemented its place as a cornerstone of Britain's aerial arsenal during the most critical years of the conflict. The global impact and legacy of the Handley Page Halifax were shaped less by its fame and more by its sheer utility. While the Lancaster became synonymous with Bomber Command's offensive, the Halifax carried a significant share of the burden and contributed across multiple theaters. Its operational record, international service, and post-war adaptations together secured it a place in aviation history, even if overshadowed by its more celebrated counterpart. Within Bomber Command, the Halifax flew more than 75,000 sorties during the war, delivering over 220,000 tons of bombs. These figures alone attest to its importance. Without the Halifax, the RAF could not have mounted the sustained strategic bombing offensive that characterized the middle and later years of the war. Its crews endured some of the highest casualty rates of any RAF unit, reflecting both the hazards of night bombing and the vulnerabilities of the aircraft itself. For those who served in it, the Halifax became a symbol of endurance and sacrifice, a bomber that demanded everything from its crews while giving Britain the striking power it desperately needed. Outside Bomber Command, the Halifax had a broad impact. In Special Operations executive missions, it provided essential support to underground resistance movements across Europe, inserting agents, delivering supplies, and dropping weapons caches that helped sustain partisan warfare. Its role in airborne operations was equally critical. During D-Day, Operation Market Garden, and the Rhine Crossing in 1945, Halifaxes towed gliders and dropped paratroopers into combat zones, linking the aircraft to some of the most decisive operations of the European campaign. In maritime warfare, it served coastal command in anti-submarine patrols and mine-laying, contributing to the long and vital struggle for control of the Atlantic sea lanes. Internationally, the Halifax saw service with the Royal Canadian Air Force, which flew thousands of operations from bases in Britain. Canadian crews in particular came to identify strongly with the type, and post-war Canada retained Halifaxes for transport and training duties. Other Commonwealth nations, including Australia and New Zealand, also flew the aircraft, primarily in the European theater under RAF operational control. After the war, surplus Halifaxes were transferred to foreign air forces, including those of Egypt and Pakistan, extending the type's operational life well into the late 1940s. The aircraft's post-war career further diversified. Demilitarized Halifaxes were adapted for civil purposes, including freight transport and aerial survey work. Their large fuselages and sturdy construction made them suitable for carrying heavy loads in commercial service, particularly in regions where modern aircraft were scarce. Although never produced in the numbers of the Lancaster, the Halifax's adaptability ensured that many examples found useful employment even after their military careers ended. In terms of technological legacy, the Halifax highlighted both the possibilities and limitations of wartime bomber design. Its evolution demonstrated how an airframe could be adapted across multiple roles, but it also underscored the challenges of producing an aircraft that was merely adequate at everything rather than outstanding at one. This lesson influenced post-war bomber development, where the emphasis shifted toward specialized performance and eventually nuclear-capable designs with jet propulsion and high-altitude capabilities that avoided the compromises inherent in the Halifax. Culturally, the Halifax did not achieve the iconic status of the Lancaster, but it remained respected among veterans and aviation historians. Memorials and preservation projects in Britain and Canada have kept its story alive, and surviving airframes and restorations provide tangible reminders of its contribution. At the National Air Force Museum of Canada in Trenton, Ontario, a restored Halifax stands as a centerpiece, symbolizing the sacrifices of Canadian crews. In Britain, recovered wrecks and partial reconstructions have been displayed in museums, reflecting the enduring interest in the aircraft despite its relative obscurity compared to the Lancaster. Ultimately, the Halifax's legacy is defined by its indispensability rather than its brilliance. It was not the best heavy bomber of the war, but without it, the RAF's campaign would have been far weaker. It played a critical role in bringing the strategic bombing offensive to scale, supported vital special operations, and adapted to maritime and airborne tasks that stretched far beyond its original design. In the broader sweep of aviation history, the Halifax remains a reminder that even flawed aircraft can be decisive when produced in numbers, used flexibly, and flown with determination by those who had no choice but to make the most of what they had. Among the less familiar chapters of the Halifax story are its secondary uses, forgotten missions, and the perspectives of those who operated it outside the spotlight of Bomber Command's nightly offensive. These aspects reveal the aircraft's adaptability, its quiet contributions beyond headline-making raids, and the way it continued to serve in roles often overlooked by history. One of the Halifax's lesser-known functions was in the field of electronic warfare and radar countermeasures. Modified aircraft carried special equipment designed to confuse or jam German radar, a critical element of Bomber Command's effort to reduce losses in the face of an increasingly effective Luftwaffe night fighter force. Some Halifaxes carried window, strips of aluminum foil dropped in clouds to create false radar returns, while others tested new radar sets, helping to refine the tactics of electronic deception. These missions were not glamorous, but proved essential in blunting the effectiveness of German defenses. Another important but often forgotten role was long-range transport. As the war advanced, Halifaxes were stripped of armament and fitted with seating or cargo equipment to move troops, supplies, and medical equipment. They ferried men and material across the Mediterranean to and from North Africa, and later supported operations in the Middle East and India. Their robustness and large capacity made them a practical choice, even if they were never designed for the comfort or efficiency of dedicated transports. The Halifax also played a role in early post-war scientific research. A handful of aircraft were used to carry experimental payloads and instruments into the upper atmosphere, studying weather conditions and aerodynamic phenomena at altitudes rarely reached by other types. This work extended the Halifax's utility beyond combat, demonstrating how wartime machines could be repurposed for peacetime science. In terms of secret projects, there were proposals, never realized, to adapt the Halifax for drone control, or as a platform for launching experimental weapons. With the advent of guided missile research, some planners considered whether large bombers like the Halifax might serve as motherships, carrying pilotless aircraft or prototypes for release. These ideas remained speculative as the rapid shift to jet propulsion and more modern bombers made them unnecessary before they could progress. The voices of veterans provide another dimension to the Halifax's lesser-known story. Crews often remembered the aircraft with mixed feelings: gratitude for its stability and resilience, frustration at its inability to match the Lancaster's performance, and sorrow for the heavy losses endured. Ground crews, in particular, valued its sturdy construction, noting that damaged Halifaxes often returned with wings shredded or engines destroyed, yet still managed to bring their crews home. Pilots frequently praised its forgiving handling during takeoff and landing, especially on war-weary airfields in poor weather, though they acknowledged its sluggish climb and lack of agility at altitude. After the war, many Halifaxes were quickly scrapped, overshadowed by the Lancaster in the public imagination. Yet some lived on in unexpected ways. Surplus aircraft found second lives in civilian hands, hauling freight in remote regions, fighting forest fires when converted into water bombers, or serving as aerial survey platforms. These peacetime uses, though largely forgotten, extended the Halifax's presence well into the 1950s, long after its combat days were over. In reflecting on its unseen chapters, the Halifax emerges as more than just a strategic bomber. It was a versatile machine that adapted to electronic warfare, clandestine operations, transport, and scientific research. It bore the imprint of a bomber that, while not perfect, proved indispensable by serving wherever it was needed. These forgotten roles reinforce the idea that the Halifax's legacy cannot be measured only in the tonnage of bombs dropped, but also in the breadth of tasks it performed, often away from the limelight. It was, in many respects, the bomber that could not hide, not only from enemy defenses, but from the demands of a total war that pressed it into every role for which it could be adapted. The final chapters of the Halifax story were written in the years immediately after 1945, when the war was over, but the aircraft still had a part to play in shaping the post-war world. While thousands of airframes were scrapped almost immediately, reflecting the speed with which Britain reduced its vast wartime fleet, the Halifax did not disappear overnight. Instead, it transitioned into peacetime roles that reflected both the adaptability of its design and the realities of a world trying to rebuild. Within the Royal Air Force, the Halifax continued to serve in transport and reconnaissance capacities for several years. Demilitarized bombers were converted into troop carriers and freighters, moving personnel, equipment, and relief supplies around the shrinking empire. In 1945 and 1946, Halifaxes flew food and aid into war-torn Europe, including relief operations in the Netherlands during the Hunger Winter. Others were employed in long-range flights to the Middle East and India, helping to support British military and political commitments abroad at a time when global air transport infrastructure was still limited. The type also saw service in the Berlin airlift of 1948-1949. one of the defining moments of the early Cold War. While Dakotas and Yorks carried the bulk of supplies, Halifaxes supplemented the effort, delivering coal and food to the blockaded city. Their large fuselages and robust construction made them suitable for heavy cargo, even if they lacked the efficiency of newer transports. In this way, the Halifax found itself involved in one of the first confrontations of the post-war era, bridging its wartime role with the emerging geopolitics of the Cold War. Internationally, several foreign air forces adopted surplus Halifaxes in the immediate post-war years. The Royal Egyptian Air Force and the nascent Royal Pakistan Air Force both operated small numbers, using them for transport, training, and patrol roles. In Canada, the Royal Canadian Air Force retained Halifaxes into the late 1940s, using them for transport, mapping, and Arctic survey flights. These operations demonstrated the aircraft's continuing utility in environments where ruggedness and capacity mattered more than cutting-edge performance. In civilian hands, converted Halifaxes found employment as freighters and aerial survey platforms. Companies in Britain and Canada used them to carry bulk cargo to remote regions, while some were adapted with cameras and equipment for mapping projects in Africa and the Arctic. Later, a number of aircraft were transformed into water bombers for firefighting, extending their careers into the 1950s and even early 1960s. These unusual second lives gave the Halifax a quiet but important presence in peacetime aviation long after its combat role had ended. The legacy of the Halifax has been preserved in museums, memorials, and the recollections of veterans. Unlike the Lancaster, only fragments and wrecks survived into the modern era, and for decades no complete Halifax remained. Restoration efforts eventually reconstructed examples from salvaged parts, with the most notable display at the National Air Force Museum of Canada in Trenton, Ontario, where a painstakingly restored Halifax now stands. In Britain, recovered wreckage from crash sites has been assembled into museum exhibits, ensuring that the aircraft's contribution is not forgotten. In historical perspective, the Halifax illustrates the realities of wartime production. An aircraft that was rushed into service, adapted continuously, and used wherever it was needed, regardless of its flaws. It was not the star of bomber command, but it was indispensable to its operations. Post-war, it transitioned into new roles, contributing to relief, transport, and early Cold War missions before fading quietly from the skies. Its story is not one of glamour, but of necessity, endurance, and versatility, qualities that made it one of the unsung yet vital aircraft of its era. The Halifax remains, in the end, a bomber that could not hide, neither from the enemy that exploited its vulnerabilities, nor from the demands of a global war that forced it into every conceivable role. Its shadow may have been cast by the Lancaster, but its service was broad, costly, and indispensable, leaving a legacy that stretches far beyond the bombing raids for which it was originally built. In the decades that followed its retirement, the Handley Page Halifax gradually faded from public attention, eclipsed by the more celebrated Avro Lancaster. Yet its legacy persisted in quieter ways, through the stories of veterans, the scattered remains of wrecks, and the research that drew upon its wartime service. The Halifax became a symbol of both the strengths and weaknesses of Britain's bomber strategy. Remembered by those who flew it as a machine that could never escape its compromises but nonetheless carried them through some of the most difficult missions of the war. Veterans' accounts highlight the duality of the aircraft's reputation. Pilots often praised the Halifax for its forgiving handling during takeoff and landing, particularly on damaged or improvised airfields. It was regarded as sturdy and reliable at low and medium altitudes, capable of absorbing damage and still returning home. Many gunners and navigators, however, recalled the sense of vulnerability they felt on missions into Germany, aware that the Halifax could not climb as high as the Lancaster or carry the heaviest bombs. Loss rates reinforced this perception. Whole squadrons at times suffered crippling casualties, and among crews, the Halifax was often considered the less desirable assignment. Despite this, bonds of loyalty formed, with many veterans later defending the aircraft as dependable, even if flawed. Wreck recovery projects in Britain and Europe after the war added new dimensions to its story. Crashed Halifaxes, once scattered across fields and forests, became sites of remembrance. Local communities in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands erected memorials to downed crews, honoring the sacrifices made during night raids that cost so many lives. These memorials, often at the crash sites themselves, connected the Halifax to local wartime memory in a way that the larger narrative sometimes overlooked. The aircraft's presence in the collective memory of occupied Europe thus survived not through fame but through the sacrifices associated with it. The Halifax's contribution to post-war aerospace research is less visible but significant. Data from its operational history informed lessons on high-altitude bombing, defensive armament, and the limitations of heavy bomber design. The shortcomings of the Halifax in performance and survivability underscored for post-war planners the need to prioritize speed, altitude, and eventually stealth in future bombers. In this sense, the Halifax played a cautionary role. It demonstrated that an aircraft adequate at the beginning of the war could quickly become outclassed, a lesson that shaped Cold War procurement and development strategies. By the late 20th century, renewed interest in the Halifax emerged among aviation historians and enthusiasts. Restoration efforts, though challenging due to the scarcity of surviving aircraft, became symbols of dedication to preserving the memory of crews who had flown in them. The painstaking reconstruction of a complete Halifax at the National Air Force Museum of Canada is one such example, achieved through international cooperation and years of work salvaging parts from wrecks. This project and others like it helped re-establish the Halifax's place in aviation heritage. In cultural memory, the Halifax has come to embody the concept of the unsung workhorse. It was not glamorous, and it did not receive the same recognition as its contemporaries, but it was essential. Its crews bore some of the heaviest losses of the air war, and their experiences illustrate the realities of strategic bombing, relentless operations, high casualty rates, and the constant tension between technological limitations and operational demands. Thus, in the post-war decades, the Halifax's story has been told less as that of a failed machine and more as part of a broader narrative of sacrifice and endurance. Its limitations were real and costly, but its contribution was vital. As veterans aged and museums preserved the surviving examples, the Halifax was re-evaluated not only as an aircraft but as a symbol of the men who flew and maintained it, a reminder that victory in the air depended as much on determination and resilience as on technical perfection. The final assessment of the Handley Page Halifax rests on its place within the larger framework of the Second World War and the evolution of strategic bombing. It was never the star of Bomber Command's arsenal, nor the most advanced of Britain's wartime designs, but it was essential. The Halifax embodied the compromises of wartime production, an aircraft that was good enough to fill an urgent need, adaptable enough to serve across multiple roles, and durable enough to remain in frontline service despite clear limitations. Measured against the Lancaster, the Halifax fell short in key performance areas. It could not climb as high, carry as heavy a load, or absorb losses with the same efficiency. These deficiencies contributed to higher casualty rates among its crews and earned it a reputation as the less desirable heavy bomber. Yet such comparisons risk obscuring the reality that Bomber Command could not have sustained its offensive without the Halifax. In terms of sorties flown, bombs dropped, and missions undertaken, it carried a significant share of the burden, often at great cost. Its contribution was not glamorous, but it was indispensable. The Halifax's adaptability further shaped its significance. From mine-laying and anti-submarine patrols to special operations and glider towing, the aircraft proved versatile in ways the Lancaster was not. It served in clandestine missions across occupied Europe, played a key role in airborne operations, and provided essential transport and relief flights after the war. These varied roles demonstrate that despite its flaws as a pure strategic bomber, the Halifax delivered value across a broad spectrum of military and humanitarian tasks. In legacy, the Halifax has come to symbolize the realities of total war. It represents the aircraft that crews flew, not because it was the best, but because it was available. It illustrates how strategic necessity often dictated choices, and how those choices shaped the experience of thousands of airmen. For many veterans, the Halifax was both a source of pride and a reminder of sacrifice, a machine that carried them through missions from which many never returned. Today, with surviving examples displayed in museums and memorials across Britain, Canada, and Europe, the Halifax is remembered less as a failure and more as an unsung hero of the war. Its story reflects the complexity of wartime aviation, an aircraft that was neither a triumph of design nor a complete disappointment, but a product of circumstance that did what was required of it. For historians and the public alike, it offers a more nuanced view of the air war, one that acknowledges that victory was built not only on exceptional machines, but also on those that were simply good enough, flown by crews whose determination compensated for technical shortcomings. The Halifax thus stands as a reminder that the outcome of the Second World War was shaped as much by endurance, adaptability, and sacrifice as by technological superiority. It was the bomber that could not hide from its vulnerabilities, from the dangers its crews faced, or from the vital role it played in bringing the war to its end.